Let's talk about repurposing blog posts into podcast episodes. Maybe you have a podcast, maybe you think podcasting isn't for you. Keep listening as I reveal how to find brilliant podcast content sitting on your website and the best ways to transform text into audio. You're listening to the Content 10x podcast, where it's all about content repurposing. I'm Amy Woods and I'm here to help you maximize your content and find smart ways to get your message in front of more of the right people, whilst also saving time. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Content 10x podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, founder of Content 10x, and in this episode, I share a process you can follow to repurpose your blog posts or articles on your website, whatever you want to call them, into powerful podcast episodes. We're going to look at, firstly, choosing the right blog posts to repurpose into podcast episodes. Secondly, structuring and planning your podcast episodes based on blog posts. And third, recording your podcast episodes, so different options and the tech involved. Okay, so let's jump in. Now at Content 10x, we work with B2B businesses, mainly in the tech and professional services space. And I can tell you firsthand that having a podcast is becoming an increasingly important component of B2B content marketing strategies. It's a way to tap into new audiences, help and connect with existing clients to boost your value and retention, and build and extend new relationships too. And also, a podcast can sit at the top of your content pyramid. So once you record podcast episodes, there's so much repurposing potential thereafter. It has all those benefits I've just mentioned, and it can also fuel your social media content and more. So it sounds great, doesn't it? Yet so many people tell me that they think they'd struggle to come up with topic ideas for a podcast. They think it doesn't seem right for them. They're worried about running out of ideas, basically, yet they're sitting on a mountain of blog posts and a mountain of content. So if you also think you'd have nothing to say on a podcast, I encourage you to go to your website. If you have written content on there, and I know that if you're listening to this podcast, then you definitely do, then that means you do have topics that could be covered in a podcast. If there are people who have enjoyed reading your content, then there are people who will also enjoy listening to it too, because we all consume content in different ways. Now, if you're not keen on hearing your own voice on a podcast or recording episodes yourself, then there's solutions for that too, and I'll cover that shortly. But first, let's talk about the content part. So you'll need to decide what blog posts you want to repurpose for your podcast. The best and fastest way to choose is to take a look at your website analytics. So check out your Google Analytics or whatever tool you like to use for website analytics and see what blog posts kept people's attention for the longest and got the most traffic. Now this data is a strong indicator of what people want to hear from you. If you can clearly see that the topic resonated with people in written format, then certainly when you're getting started with your podcast, it's a good idea to start here. These topics seem to offer you a best shot at attracting attention and interest in your podcast. So I recommend starting with your top 5 blog posts or so and going from there. Now, the good news is that blog posts provide a brilliant framework for podcast episodes. It saves you lots of time that you've already got all your thoughts and key facts and statistics prepared because you've written that blog post already. But it's important to remember that a blog post isn't a script. If you read a blog post out loud, it's going to sound wooden and it just won't sound like how people really speak. And that's a huge turn off for podcast audience listeners. Nobody wants to hear someone just robotically reading a blog post. So here's what you can do instead. A quick way to make your blog post ready for audio is to pull out the key points and make a list of bullet points to cover. Don't worry too much about sticking to the original blog text because you're repurposing it, not copying it. So it's going to be different when you speak about this topic. And if you want a little more guidance than just some bullet points, you can go a step further and storyboard it out. So you could use note cards like a speech if that works for you. So break your post down into key points and prompts to help you speak about the same topic, and be confident you wrote the blog post, you know what you're speaking about. You're just being guided and prompted through these notes that you've made. Or you can rewrite the blog post as a complete script. Now this is quite time consuming, but it could be worth it, because remember, a script needs to be written how people speak. It's not how people write. If you have a script, then using a teleprompter is a great idea if you're recording a video podcast. So if you don't have a teleprompter, but you're planning on doing scripted video podcasts, then I highly recommend that you invest in one. They save so much time. If you're taking this approach, the best way to rewrite your blog post is to just imagine explaining the topic to your client or to a colleague, and this will help you get a much more natural speech pattern than the one you write in. And of course, read it out, speak it out loud, and check that it's how you would speak. Now, I just mentioned teleprompters. As we're talking about tech, I'll just take a moment to cover the necessities here. So teleprompters aren't a necessity unless, as I mentioned, you're recording a video podcast and using a script. Then they're really, really useful. But mics are. I do strongly recommend using a high quality microphone to record your podcast episodes. The last thing you want to do is use the built-in mic on your laptop. That's not going to give you a good enough sound quality. And sound quality is extremely important for listeners. The last thing you want to do with your fantastic content is spoil it with really bad audio. Now, I use a Samsung Q2U microphone and I highly recommend it. It's really, really good. Or of course, you can just go and do your own research. There's so many articles out there and so many pieces of advice on what is the best microphone. So find the best one for you. But I really do recommend invest in the sound quality. The other thing is you'll need some software to record your podcast episode. So to record the audio, I use Descript, 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 and I really do recommend that. I think it's fantastic. There's also Audacity, which I used to use and sometimes still use, and Adobe Audition as well, which my team use, my creative team that do audio production use Adobe Audition. And if you want, you can use this software to edit your podcast episodes too, or just get the raw files. So do the recording, get the raw files and send it off to a professional team for editing. Now that does help take a load off your plate. So I highly, highly recommend that you don't become a podcast producer alongside your day job. Find professionals that you can help you with this. Hey, just a little break from this week's episode to let you know about becoming a Content 10x Insider. If you want more content repurposing tips and advice, then why not join hundreds of business owners, marketers and content creators who get them delivered straight to their inbox once a week by subscribing to the Content 10x newsletter. As well as tips and advice, you get industry updates, inspiring stories, exclusive content, offers and more. You can subscribe at content10x.com/newsletter and there's a link in the show notes too. Okay, back to this week's episode. And I mentioned before that there are other options if you don't want to be the voice of your podcast. So if you or somebody in your business doesn't want to be the voice of the podcast, there are text-to-speech apps out there that will read out loud your blog post for you or your script version of your post and turn it into an audio file. There's Speechify and Natural Readers, which are just two examples, but there are so many other sites and softwares out there that can help you with this. So here you would just upload your blog post or the script and get a voice recording of it back. But a massive warning here is that the recording back could be pretty robotic. So think about the reason why you're podcasting, think about your audience and your brand and what works for you and whether that would be acceptable for you. Now, some sites offer voiceover artists that you can commission to read your posts or scripts out, and that's going to have a lot more gusto. You can, of course, hire a freelance voiceover artist too, so you don't have to go through apps or sites. If having a voiceover artist does sound like the best option for you, I'd recommend hiring the same voiceover artist for all your episodes to be the voice of your brand. I think about it a bit like audiobooks and how Stephen Fry is the iconic voice of the Harry Potter novel. So it's good to have the audio and voice consistency with your episodes. Now, whichever voice recording option you go for, remember that there are other podcast-specific elements that you'll most likely want to include too. For example, intros and outros, maybe a mid-roll, and music, all very common features of podcast episodes. Not essential, but very common features. Now, if you're smart about it, you can record just one intro, one outro, and possibly a mid-roll that can be applied to all of your podcast episodes. So you do this once, and then they go into all the episodes. Personally, I would advise not skipping these components because they're brilliant for helping you to build your audio brand as a podcast and create a much better listener experience. Most B2B podcasts have an intro that mentions what the podcast is about and who it's for, just short and brief. And your outro should be a friendly wrapping up of the content with a call to action, such as to follow you on social media or get a download or join your email list, whatever it may be. Now, music and mid-roll ads can be used at your discretion, but like I said, I do really recommend them. And if you have a mid-roll, think about including a short call to action. So just interrupt the show and do a brief mid-roll to ask people to get some freebie that you're offering or join your newsletter or whatever the best call to action is for you. You just edit these podcast-specific elements in after you've recorded the main audio. So after you've recorded the Repurpose blog or read out the script, you then have the audio file and you're going to add these podcast-specific elements in afterwards. Or, of course, give them to your podcast editing team who will take care of all of this for you. And then you'll have your finished podcast episode. And finally, you'll want to write some accompanying show notes for the podcast apps and repurpose it into promotional content for social media too. But that is an episode for another day. So if you have plenty of blog posts on your website and you've been thinking about launching a podcast, I hope this episode has inspired you. Or if you already have a podcast but you're running dry on content ideas, then again, I hope I've really inspired you to look to the content that already exists on your website. Because the content is there, you just need to find the best way for you to turn blog post content into audio content. And believe me, your audience will thank you for it. Now, if you need help or support launching, editing or repurposing your podcast, then do get in touch. We offer a fully done-for-you end-to-end podcast repurposing service here at Content 10x. We take all the fiddly editing and repurposing off your plate so that you have more time to focus on the most important priorities for your business. So visit content10x.com to find out more. Now, I hope you found this episode useful. If you have any questions, thoughts, or just want to get in touch, then do contact me on social media. I'm at Content10x on all the social media platforms. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to know what you'd like me to cover in future episodes as well. So all that's left to say is thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.